I would like to propose a few remarks based on what in the report is called the 5 findings of the report, which I will briefly summarize. And of course, I will make some very free remarks from, I would say, an outsider perspective. The first of those 5 findings is success to develop technological capabilities in emerging countries depends on the role of national governments to provide support for renewable energy technologies. And this raises a number of questions. For example, if governments want to indeed support the spread of renewable energy technologies, they have to tackle a number of issues related to governance. One is the proper functioning of the banking system. Without an efficient banking system, there is no way that SMEs, for example, can really develop an endogenous capability, an industrial base for, I would say, the dissemination of the use of markets of renewable energy technologies. The second element is, of course, the need to, especially also again in developing countries, to enhance the quality of public procurement procedures. Most of SMEs, most of companies in developing countries, if they were to get contracts related to renewable energy technologies, they simply cannot afford the current state of affairs in which in most of the cases they get a contract, they have to get finance from the bank, they have to provide for the goods, and eventually 1 year after they will be paid by the government. This is just unsustainable. And of course the third point, if indeed governments are to support the rise of renewable energy technologies in developing countries, is to increase the international cooperation to fight against corruption. Corruption remains a major obstacle and impediment to the diffusion of new markets for emerging technologies. And I would say that in the case of renewable energy technologies, the fight against corruption should be an integral part of the fight against climate change. Issues are related. The second finding of the report is that developing countries should not subsidize too much conventional energy sources, but consider different kinds of energy regimes prioritizing renewable energy technologies. And this raises, of course, the major question of the availability of finance, as we have all seen through the previous presentations, how capital intensive are renewable energy technologies, even if we also know that some of them are cheap. But then we have some very interesting avenues. One of them, of course, is to increase revenues through environmental trade. And as you know, there are a number of proposals of green trade pacts in view of cutting tariffs on environmental goods and services, therefore providing more revenues that can be used, indeed, to support the renewable energy technology diffusion. There is also a number of emerging financial players that could play an important role, especially in developing countries. One of it is Islamic finance, Islamic banking. Islamic banking is starting to show interest into green finance, into renewable and alternative energy technologies. And of course, one can easily see that there is a correlation between the ethical nature of Islamic banking and the ethical nature of green finance and sustainable capitalism. Another big player, which is very much concentrated in the south, even if there are such funds in north countries, is of course sovereign wealth funds, which are set to gather around $5 to $6 trillion of liquidities in the next 5 years. And a new trend of sovereign wealth funds, most of them based in resource-rich southern countries, is that they are now becoming very much interested into renewable energy technologies. And by the way, recently, the WWF published the first big study showing this new trend of green investments from sovereign funds. So there is here an interesting new resource that could be available to developing countries on which many of those sovereign funds have big interest because it is within their areas of regional influence. The third finding of the report is that success in eliminating or reducing energy poverty through the use of renewable energy technologies does not need large-scale projects or huge investments. And then again, I would like to say that one of the issues that could be related to that in terms of policy is, of course, empowerment of women. Women plays an extremely important role in developing countries at community level and also in terms of micro-entrepreneurship. And this is particularly true, for example, in rural electrification projects in India, for example, but not only. And this brings me to another point, which is the fact that there should be a much stronger linkage between the Millennium Development Goals, the overall policies about climate change mitigation, and the spread of renewable energy technologies. As you know, some of the MDGs will not be reached by 2015. All of them correlate human development to gender equality, to environmental performance. I think that putting more emphasis on the empowerment of women, on the Millennium Development Goals, is another way to empower, I would say, the spread of renewable energy at a big or at a small scale. The fourth finding of the report is that creating an integrated innovation policy framework is important in developing countries, especially because there are few incentives can bring big achievements. Well, in that I would say, spirit, what is at stake as well is the issue of how, indeed, to integrate innovation frameworks. In most of developing countries, there is not sufficient means in the state or sufficient critical mass of domestic markets so that really the notion of integrated innovation policy frameworks can be effective. In that case, we need much more regional cooperation or even inter-regional cooperation. The fact is that most regional organizations in the world do not have really a very strong, I would say, intergovernmental dimension. At the end of the day, the two only groupings in the world who can be really considered as a strong intergovernmental organization are the European Union and the Gulf Cooperation Council. So we have tens of regional organizations, but they lack the means of, I would say, strong integration policies. On the other hand, we have all over the world another kind of actors who are the regional development banks, which can very much fulfill this role, because at the end of the day, they finance, they are used, they have proven methodologies, they are, I would say, very much used to cooperation at regional and inter-regional level. So I think that one of the ways to boost those integrated innovation policy frameworks is to enhance not only the role of major regional development banks, but of course to enhance cooperation among them at regional and inter-regional level. And finally, the fifth finding of the report is, of course, the value of experience, of knowledge sharing and benchmarking, the fact that there are different policy combinations that can be pulled for better results, and the need for, of course, better science politics. And there I would like to use a benchmark, which is what has been realized within the European Union. The immense value, not only, I would say, to have funding, because you may not have all the time massive R&D or science budgets in developing countries, but what has been proven through the decades experience of what we call the framework research programs in the European Union is that methodology, networking, allowing the diffusion of scientific knowledge, the pooling of teams can bring sometimes more result than just funding. And there I think that it could be very interesting to embark developing countries into best practices and benchmarking policies, and, for example, to insist on some of the things that have been working so well in the European Union research and development policy that could be replicable in developing countries. For example, to enhance the eligibility and involvement of developing countries into international research and development programs, to help developing countries design their R&D efforts, to concentrate funds in result-oriented clusters. The European Union in the beginning started spreading billions of euros of subsidies into small programs, and progressively in the 7th framework program decided to concentrate big amounts of funds in research that can really be translated into economic gains and not just only fundamental research. Of course, there is the need to help research teams or universities from developing countries better integrate into networks of research of bigger magnitude. This is absolutely fundamental. For example, if you are developing a technology and you have access through a European, through your eligibility to a European or American or Asian development program to a network of thousands of partners, you have an extraordinary leverage effect on your capabilities to benefit from information or to disseminate your own research. And finally, it is extremely important to help developing countries, and this could be also indirectly the role of development banks, as the BEE does in Europe, to mutualize the means of innovation. And by mutualizing means of innovation, it starts with building research centers. You need loans for the ground, you need loans for building, for equipment. This is done also through banks. You need also to mutualize the scientific means. There is no need to duplicate in one region or in one continent the same kind of equipments for the same kind of research. And this is also one of the lessons of subsidiarity that we have learned from the methodologies used in the European Union. So these are basically a few remarks which I wanted to make to show that these reports, beyond its, I would say, extremely rich content, still stimulates a great deal of reflections and of proposals. Thank you.